Hi and welcome to this podcast. My name is Richard Hayton and I'm the convener of the Political Studies Association Specialist Group for the Study of Conservative Politics, and I'm at the University of Hull today where we've been enjoying a conference on the theme of the Conservatives in coalition government. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined now by Edward Ashbee, who is an Associate Professor at Copenhagen Business School. And Eddie's current research has really been revolving around issues to do with political economy, with particular reference to the policy formulation process in the UK and the US. So, Eddie, many thanks for being with us for this podcast today. Firstly, could you say something to evaluate the nature of the relationship, if any, between the British Conservative Party and the American Republicans?
There have always been barriers preventing the Republicans and the Conservatives having a closer relationship. They come from very different contexts, very different backgrounds. American Republicans have for a long time now emphasised social issues to a much greater extent than the British Conservatives. They play in a much more effective way over there. But nonetheless, despite that, there have occasionally been overlaps and exchanges. So we saw, for example, during the Thatcher-Reagan era, a certain exchange of style, a certain exchange of culture, a certain exchange of forms of expression, as well as some economic policy overlaps. So there have been those exchanges at times. More recently, we've seen the idea of an ownership society, which developed as Thatcherism developed during the 1980s and then into the early 90s, that making its way across the Atlantic and informing some of the policies adopted by the Bush administration.
One of the really controversial social issues in the US at the moment is the issue of gay marriage.
Yep.
That's something which David Cameron has advocated in the UK, confirming in some people's eyes his status as a metropolitan liberal. But how can that social liberalism, as exemplified by those proposals, be reconciled with more traditional Toryism?
There's a paradox here, isn't there, that on both sides of the Atlantic, the gay marriage issue has been framed by those Conservatives who favour it in traditional Tory terms. So they've talked about same-sex marriage as a way of strengthening the family, about extending the family to same-sex couples. In other words, building Tory principles and extending them several stages further. Now, the problem is traditional Conservatives aren't buying it. And they're not buying it partly because they don't believe it's electorally sensible, but also because it conflicts with the basic values that they hold. Not just because they see marriage in heterosexual terms, but also, of course, because the issue of same-sex marriage has implications if your country has an established church. In Denmark, just recently, we've seen that where same-sex marriage has now just been introduced. The established church has been compelled, by virtue of being the established church, to marry same-sex couples, despite the moral objections of many members of that church. And I think if it's pushed in this country, if Mr. Cameron develops it in the way that seems possible, although I think the greater likelihood is that he's going to back down on it. If he does push it, I think those sort of issues will be raised here and raised very forcefully by traditional Conservatives.
So are there any lessons that could be drawn electorally by the US Republicans from the British Conservatives, or indeed the other way around?
Well, I think it's more lessons from the UK possibly making their way across the Atlantic to the US. There's a group of commentators at the moment, David Brooks of the New York Times, David Frum, a Bush speechwriter. They've been arguing that US Republicans need to take the lessons of Cameron on board. They need to reach out to centre ground voters. They need to embrace the language of social liberalism, at least on some issues, more maybe same-sex marriage than, say, abortion. And they also need to have some kind of sensitivity to the role of government. You can't just say, let's get rid of government, and that's caricaturing a bit, but that's what some US Republicans appear to say. You've got to say, government can play some sort of positive role. And those Republican commentators would draw on the experiences of some of the Tea Party-backed candidates in the 2010 midterm elections and say, unless we change, it's going to be electorally difficult and potentially electorally dangerous. We've got to take on board what's been happening in the UK and try and explore the kind of ideas that Cameron has been exploring in a US context. Now, having said that those commentators are arguing that case, and they've argued it very forcefully at times, there are big problems that will prevent those ideas going much further. Because the US parties are so different, because the Republican Party has got a very different institutional character, it has to be much more sensitive to grassroots movements, and movements grow up around the many access points that US politics offer. That means in practice there are many gatekeeping processes that will effectively prevent the import of Cameronism into the US.
Eddie, many thanks for joining us. It's been really interesting talking to you.
You're welcome.
And thank you for watching this podcast.